Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds, and today I'm hanging out with Adam Koebel, um, with numerous credits to your name. Your role play DM, Dungeon World. You have your own Twitch stream with shows on there. So you've been doing a lot of things. You've been around for a while. As a matter of fact, when we first got started, you were some of the folks that we looked up to. When we were building our channel and what we wanted to do. So I want to thank you for being a front runner.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm glad. That's always nice to hear.
So Dungeon World is one of those games that is on my to play list that I haven't gotten to yet. And I wanted to ask you, so how did Dungeon World come about? And have you worked on any other games?
Yeah, so I've done some like bits and pieces here and there. I've done a couple of like Kickstarter stretch goals. I did one for Headspace, one for a game called Apelion. I'm working on a Kickstarter kind of bonus upgrade for Blades in the Dark. But as far as like full game designs go, Dungeon World is my jam. That's the one thing I've done. Sort of put the most effort into. I'm in kind of a weird, it's funny because I think about game design and I talk about game design all the time, but the amount of time I actually have to design games is like just this tiny sliver. But there was a time when I had a 9-to-5 and I spent the rest of my time designing Dungeon World. And yeah, it came about sort of as a response to and a necessity of actual play, which I think is true of like a lot of small press design, right? Like if you don't work at a Paizo or a Wizards of the Coast and you get assigned to products and you're designing things, you're probably designing them because you want to play them at home, right? You're making a new class for your 5e game, or you're making a dungeon or whatever. And for us, for Sage and I, we started on Dungeon World because I was playing a game of AD&D at home. I was playing in 2 campaigns. I was running AD&D for some friends of mine who were real amateurs at role-playing games. And so it was kind of one of those games, and I think every DM has had this experience where the players are like, I don't know, I do the thing. You tell me which of these funny dice to roll. I don't care about the numbers. I don't know what class I am. Just I want to describe my character doing stuff. So I was playing that, and if you played AD&D, you know that's a miserable way to play Dungeons & Dragons. And I was playing Apocalypse World. And I went to a little convention in Seattle called Go Play. A guy there named Tony Dowler was working on a little mini game called Apocalypse D&D, which is AD&D and Apocalypse World. He had some notes on it, and he'd shared those with some other folks, and we'd played it. And Sage and I both kind of went home and worked on our own version of it. And we were comparing notes and kind of engaging with the community. And it seemed like a lot of people wanted to play a more kind of narratively focused dungeon adventure game. They were looking for something that felt like Apocalypse World, but that they could still be like a chaotic elf wizard. And so we got to a point where Sage and I just decided to merge our efforts and make one game. And Tony and Vincent Baker, the author of Apocalypse World, were both great about it. They were like, yeah, just take the notes, take the framework from Apocalypse World, go ahead and hack it, build your own thing. And we worked on it for about a year and a half before we did the Kickstarter and released the game. And it's been out, I guess, for almost 5 years now, and people are still playing it, which is to me like just so great and kind of baffling, because you make a thing and you're super aware of all of the little details and things about it that you're like, I wish we could have done this different, or like everybody's more critical of their own art. So it's really cool that the community is still so into it. And I think that's probably because we built it so that other people could build their own content, right? Because everybody's D&D is a little different. And while our D&D didn't involve like gnomish gunslingers, maybe yours does. So I think putting the rules in there to let people make their own stuff really helped lengthen the lifespan of the game.
I feel like, even though I haven't played Dungeon World, I feel like it's greatly influenced how we actually play the game now. I was telling you a little bit before we went live how, we kind of used to play and live in a bubble when it came to RPGs. And it wasn't until we started doing Nerdarchy that we started getting exposed to so many more ideas, watching other content creators hanging out on spaces on the internet, and it's really elevated our game and has improved it with more agency to the players. It's not just the GM's game anymore. And I feel like things like Dungeon World is where that kind of spawned from.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to take sole credit for that. There's a lot of these sort of small press games, and I think what happens, there's an arc that every role player kind of follows, and maybe the arc changes depending on what year we're talking about. But I think that everybody goes through this sort of hero's journey where they're like, they don't know what Dungeons and Dragons is. They don't know anything about role playing games. Maybe they've seen Stranger Things. Maybe they saw the episodes of Community, and they're like, oh yeah, RPGs exist, but I have no idea what those are. Then they know D&D exists, and they're like, oh, D&D is role-playing games, right? This is like, when they think of RPGs, that's where they go. And then the third phase is when you learn that there are all these other games. And that's when I think RPGs as a hobby for a person really start to bloom. Because even if you keep playing D&D, you can pick up tips and tools and bits and pieces of strategy from games like Dungeon World, or like Burning Wheel, or any of the other games that are out there. And I think that this isn't a new thing, right? Like, this isn't something that Twitch or the internet or YouTube or anything has really done, because we had these same arcs happening in like the early 90s where people were like, D&D is the only thing. And then Vampire came out and people were like, what? You could be a cool goth? Vampire's a thing. There's different kinds of games than D&D. And I love that. My personal mission is to get people playing like weird small press games they would never have heard of if they just played D&D. And I think that even if you just go back to D&D, you're going to carry the lessons from, Dogs in the Vineyard or whatever with you when you go back to play that game.
Yeah, we had a friend who was singing the praises for Blades in the Dark for a while. Mm-hmm. Quite a few people actually, and it's it's just like another one that's on the list. The list like just keeps building and building. Our group, like when I started gaming, when I was a teenager, we actually played D&D, but then we played like one session of like almost everything.
Yeah. Well, people forget, I think, that other games came out like real early. Traveler came out like fairly quickly after D&D did. And there were a ton of, kind of like in PC gaming, like after Doom came out, there were all these like first person shooters before we knew to call them first person shooters. There's games that were like, well, it's basically D&D, but I don't like this thing, or there's not enough detail for this thing. All these little fantasy heartbreakers that are basically just D&D with a couple of rules changed. The sort of proto Pathfinders of early D&D.
Well, even D&D, I mean, TSR put out a lot of different games as well in the beginning.
Yeah.
Like, we can do this with everything, because there was Marvel Phase Rip, DC had Mayfair had DC.
Yeah.
You had Gangbusters, Boot Hill, Gamma World, Star Frontiers.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, as soon as D&D kind of like popped the seal, then like the floodgates opened. And they're like, oh, well, we can do all these other genres as well. There was a Lord of the Rings game. There was, there was something for everybody, and it's only evolved and gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
We actually stream a game once a week right now that we play in a Supers game, where we actually went back to the Marvel Phase Rip game. Mm-hmm. Which we're having a blast with.
Yeah, I think there's the hobby is old enough now, like it's been around long enough that there are people who are getting into it and learning about and becoming interested in its history. So they're taking a look at these older games. Like you can see like the whole OSR exists because people are like, hey, you know what? Like Moldvay Basic was a real good version of D&D. Let's go back and look at what made that design so good. And I think that's really cool, and it's neat seeing that happen as we're getting into these generational shifts where people are looking back at the older games and checking those things out. It's super cool seeing that happen.
We kind of try and cheat a little bit, and like primarily our channel is a D&D channel, but we use that as a platform to also try and introduce other games to people. So any given week, 70-80% of our content will be D&D. But then we like to use that platform to go, oh, wait a minute, guys, look, no, there's really other games you can play as well, because we always get those questions. How do you do this with D&D? And generally my answer is like, why would you?
Yeah, well, I think that's That's a weird mythology that has sprung up around role-playing games in general, right? There's this conflict between wanting to see role-playing games as being capable of doing anything, right? They're games of your imagination. If you don't have rules for something, you can make a ruling, you can create your own thing. There's the conflict between that and the fact that like D&D is a game about something, right? If you want to play a starfaring game about shipping minerals from one world to another and avoiding pirates and making deals, you cannot do that with Dungeons and Dragons without completely rewriting the game. And there's this idea, I think, among some gamers that say, no, D&D can do anything. I don't need any other game. I have spent the money, I have spent the time, I have learned, insert name of game here, because I think you see this with GURPS, Savage Worlds, D&D, like anything that the group has entrenched itself in, and then they refuse to play anything else. And then there are settings and there are material that try to patch that gap. But I would way rather play a game that is built from the ground up to do the thing than try to force D&D to be a square peg in a spaceship filled hole, right? Like I think that design really matters. And it's cool seeing people learn that, and it's nice to be able to share that with people, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably terrible to say on a D&D table, but channel, but in essence, the only thing D&D does well is D&D, and that's fine. It doesn't have to do anything else.
I know. Well, that's the thing, right? Like you can make a game that does a bunch of things kind of okay. It's passable for a bunch of stuff. Or you can make a game that does one thing really well. And I think this is sort of what's at the core of the OSR, the core of D&D. And D&D has struggled as a brand and as a game with this, in that D&D is best when it's about exploring and fighting monsters and getting treasure, right? When you try to make it about anything else, it starts to fall apart because it doesn't support you. I find, like, I have a pet peeve when people tell me stories about, like, well, the best session of D&D I ever had, we played for 6 hours and we never even rolled any dice. And I'm like, why are you playing D&D then? Like, why even use that system? Because if the game isn't helping you, if the game isn't there kicking the action along, making things exciting and fun, you're not playing that game anymore. It's just sort of existing vestigially. Now I think you can change it. I think I'm very much in favor of adding mechanisms to games, bending D&D in your own way. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about, ultimately all game design is about solving problems at the table. So if you want to play D&D, if you still want to be a wizard and you want to be an elf, but you also want to do courtly intrigue, you and your group or whatever, you're going to have to bend D&D. And I think that's the sort of thing that makes role-playing games so exciting for me, is not that you can do anything and ignore the rules, but that you can create mechanisms that will engender a fiction that does whatever you want it to do, which is super cool.
So what is your preferred genre? Because I know you've played in many different.
I like genres that reinforce and boost up the mechanisms of the game that I'm playing. I think as long as the two things are in line, I mean, I've played all kinds of games, right? I've played, historically accurate games about Iceland in the year 900 that explore themes of, gender roles in ancient Viking mythology. I've played games where you play all the all-women bomber squads of the Soviet Union in World War II. But I also really love playing Dungeons and Dragons. Like I'm a sci-fi guy at heart when it comes to movies and books, right? Like I grew up on Alien and Blade Runner, and I had a great kind of education as a kid in sci-fi, and fantasy sort of came to me by way of D&D. But when it comes to role-playing games, as long as the setting and the mechanisms reinforce and sort of boost each other, I will play just about anything, and do so happily. But when it comes to GMing, there's always that little extra spark for me when it's a sci-fi game.
I actually started reading Cyberpunk because I was just like, I can't do any more fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say fantasy was my thing, but after like 20, 30 years or so, I was like, I think I need to change it up a little bit.
Yeah.
And that, and growing up, I was always into comic books, and and sci-fi as well. So
I mean, the thing too about the hobby is you can't swing a mace without hitting 10 fantasy RPGs, right? And everybody, I feel like at some point or another, every company has made a fantasy RPG, and it's like it's we want to get in on that market. People think of RPGs and D&D. When you say to somebody it's a role-playing game, they're like immediately like funny hat, chainmail, +5 sword. Like that's where they go, because that's our history. Like if Traveler had come out first and D&D was a response to it, I feel like we'd be in a really different place now than we are, right? Like this is just the course that this history has taken us.
Well, that's an interesting question, because it comes down to like what is actually really more popular, fantasy or sci-fi, and like anything, it can shift and change. Yeah. But the sci-fi games just never seem to do quite as well as fantasy for whatever reason.
I mean, I think the reason for that is D&D, right? In that the branding is so strong, the idea that role-playing games and fantasy go so closely together that you have to get over that hurdle of teaching someone what a sci-fi RPG is, right? It's I mean, hell, like I'm the only role-playing game I ever published is a fantasy role-playing game. So, that's where most people start in the space, and it's the easiest way to kind of get your foot in the door. So it's, I think it's a case of the more people become aware of the more games that are out there, the more that field will level. But as long as D&D is the flagship, right? As long as Wizards of the Coast are the ship at the head of the fleet, we'll always have that attachment between fantasy and RPGs.
Well, I guess there's also the nostalgia factor too, like you said, and it's like being first is a big deal, is a big deal, and it becomes synonymous. Like you could say, you can name almost any role-playing game to a norm, right? And they're not going to know what you're talking about. But you say D&D or Dungeons and Dragons, instantly conjures a vision in their mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing, right? There's a reason why E.T. and Stranger Things and every other situation in which role-playing games have been portrayed in mainstream media use D&D, because if it was an episode of a TV show and they were playing Vampire the Masquerade, some of us would be like, "Oh, that's a role-playing game. I know what's going on here. I know what a gangrel is." But most people would be like, "What the hell is going on?" Like, but if you're like, "Oh, they're playing D&D," there's some attachment to that idea because D&D was such a big cultural factor for a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's this idea of hobby, industry, culture, and it's all tied together around D&D. D&D is the flagship, and people associate fantasy to RPGs.
So there's a couple questions, and also, guys, in the description, as always, there is links to find Adam. Matt, you're asking about his equipment. He actually has all of his system stuff, I believe, on your Twitch channel.
Yep.
So you can actually jump over there and get all the specs, easy peasy. Aaron has a question. Have you played Cyberpunk 2020? Supposed to be getting a video game soon. I have not.
Cyberpunk. So Cyberpunk, yeah, we're getting a video game. I think it's Cyberpunk 2077. They're also updating the role-playing game, so we're gonna get a new edition of the role-playing game to go along with the hype that's building around the game. It's by CD Projekt Red, which is the Witcher folks, and I think they make good games. But Cyberpunk as a role-playing game is so out of date. Like if you go back and you look at it, the rules feel like they were written in the mid 80s. The setting is just so like grotesquely over the top. The art is terrible, but it's kind of the only big name Cyberpunk role-playing game that is like pure Cyberpunk that isn't Shadowrun, right? Because your options, when people say to you, "Hey, you want to play a Cyberpunk role-playing game?" most people will think Shadowrun or Cyberpunk 2020 or 2050 or 2077, whatever the edition is. I've played it a few times, and I can't. It's like going back and playing a Nintendo 64 game that just wasn't very good to begin with. I'm like, I'm gonna go try to find something else. So I'll play like the Sprawl or the Veil, or I'll play playing one of the sort of newer Cyberpunk games that are out there. But I am curious about the game. I'm super curious about the role playing game that's going to come along with it, and I'll definitely check it out. I got high hopes, but we'll see.
I feel like one of the hard things with anything like that, where you're talking about near future, is the actual technology levels advance so fast.
Yeah,
so fast we blew by Shadowrun.
So Cyberpunk, yeah. So you get into this position where, like, I think people forget that there is this very thin line, at least in my opinion, between Cyberpunk and near future sci-fi. Right? Near future sci-fi is just like, what could things be like the day after tomorrow? And it's really all sci-fi is about today. Sci-fi is not actually about the future. Sci-fi is about, what do we feel anxious about today? What are we feeling like nervous or worried about? What is interesting to us now? Let's make fiction about that. If you play a Cyberpunk game, you're exploring themes of what made the early 80s nervous. And so a Cyberpunk game that isn't about that isn't really, in my mind, Cyberpunk. Like, the whole idea there is, monolithic corporations, the dehumanization of the workforce, this idea of giving up your humanity to become a technological entity. And the way that it's put out there is very specific for the time that it's in. It's like the sci-fi of the 50s. It's like sci-fi of the 60s. Like, they exist in a milieu for a reason. But what's really interesting is that I think we're seeing a resurgence of cyberpunk, right? I think that things like Altered Carbon getting made into a Netflix series, other kind of near future corporate dystopian sci-fi coming out is because what we're anxious about now is like mega corporate dystopia, right? Like, we have this same fears that we had, but instead of them being about Japan, they're about America or about Korea or China now. So it's really interesting watching these ebbs and flows of that stuff happen. Cyberpunk is very much of an age, and I think that if you update it like Shadowrun did, like if you look at the technology in Shadowrun 5e, it's all augmented reality and all of that. It's not really Cyberpunk. Like, I wouldn't call Shadowrun Cyberpunk anymore, but first edition Shadowrun is very Cyberpunk because it exists in those spaces, right? It has those anxieties.
It's kind of Tronish now.
Which is fine. Like, you can absolutely do that, right? If you want to stay modern, you make your sci-fi game about today, about the anxieties of today, and you keep track of what those are. But I also think, there is this sort of combination anxiety nostalgia that goes with the things that Cyberpunk is about.
Did you see the Kickstarter? It's up right now. We actually had Chad Walker on the show for Sigmata.
I have not. No.
So yeah, it's very, very political and inspired by what's going on today, and the uprisings in the East and everything like that. So you might find it interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it now. It's the insurgency against the fascist regime. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I've seen this. Some folks pass this across my desk. Well, right, like that's very much a game that's in the zeitgeist. It's a game that's being created to explore things that are nerve-inducing to us today, for sure.
It's but talking to the creator is kind of like a mashup between Cyberpunk and like a Supers game. So it definitely has some interesting.
Well, I think that's a power fantasy thing, right? In that when we look at, so here's the thing about Cyberpunk, right? Where we can look at our own lives and we can say, all these big corporations, like Disney is buying Fox and the FCC is shutting down net neutrality, and like all of these things are happening that are very Cyberpunk lines. And we look at ourselves and our friends and we're like, well, how do I combat this? Right? Like, I can tweet about this. I can protest, but a lot of the time we feel like helpless or powerless against these larger things. And that's why when we write games like Shadowrun, we're like, yes, like racism is real and the corporate dystopia is real, but like you can get cybernetic limbs and magic and you could be a troll, and now you can fight back. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that we take these anxieties, and because role-playing games give us agency to act theoretically in these worlds, we can give ourselves fictionalized tools to directly and aggressively combat the things that we are personally anxious about at a cultural level. Which is, I think, a thing that games in general, but role-playing games particularly, empower us to do, is to explore those kinds of things, which is why I think sci-fi in RPGs is so important.
Well, it's a great escapism, and like you said, it is a chance for us to exercise some power in a world where we feel powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So TrueMate has a question, wants to know what's your favorite sci-fi RPG.
If I had to just pick one, if I was like all other sci-fi role-playing games evaporate from the earth, I would probably go with Stars Without Number. It's a sandbox sci-fi role-playing game by Kevin Crawford, who's an amazing designer. Yeah, I've played a lot of it. Our first role-play campaign, Swan Song, used Stars Without Number. The revised second edition just came out, and it's great. You can do so much with it. And it can tell a bunch of different kinds of sci-fi story, which I think is really important if you're going to have that hypothetical all other games evaporate. Like, I could tell cyberpunk stories with those rules. I could tell space opera stories. We could do Dune. We could do Neuromancer. We could do Aliens. It's a very flexible system. So, yeah, I really, really like that game a lot.
Sweet. We actually, not too long ago, we played Shadowrun, but using Cypher System.
Mm-hmm.
It actually worked out. It worked out pretty well.
I feel like everyone has that story where they're like, we played insert 90s role-playing game using insert modern role-playing game, because Vampire and Shadowrun and a bunch of other these games in that period of design had amazing worlds. Like Shadowrun and Vampire particularly have these beautifully thought out complex worlds, but their rules suck so bad. Which isn't their fault. It was, 1989, and we didn't know any better yet. But like, I think that's a thing that we're desperate for, right? The number of times people have said, like, do you think I could play Shadowrun using Fate or GURPS or like some other game that allows a broader kind of adaptation? Yeah, that's a super common thing. But it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in this, that I think that mechanisms of a game need to support the themes directly. And it can be hard when you're using a generic system to try to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I always make the joke that 80s role-playing games were they were ranked in order on how many tables and charts that the designers could put into them. And
yeah, I mean, we split in two directions, right? On the one hand, we went for like Harn, and it was like, here's 64 pages of the weather. We get these games that are like that are hyper simulationist and trying to create a sense of uniform reality. And then the other direction was this attempt to strip away a lot of the rules and create a game environment where the story was like the main thing. But I think that idea didn't really get realized until much later. A lot of those games are still like, basically they function the same way Dungeons and Dragons did. The White Wolf games are more or less just superhero games. And I think that it took another generation or two to really kind of get into a space where the mechanisms encourage narrative in the way that the designers wanted.
one of the things that I'm kind of noticing as we go back and we're playing Marvel Phase Rip, I'm amazed at how innovative they were for their time and how far ahead it was, and they never really got any recognition for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a ton of these old games that, and again, like the new fans getting into games, the great thing about role-playing games is that while the mechanics won't necessarily age well, you can always go back and you can find some interesting bit about the way that they were produced, the way they were made, that both acts as a sort of fossil record for games at the time. Like, there's a reason Shadowrun and Vampire are bad in the ways that they're bad. They're also good in other ways that we've improved on. And so, you go back and you can find these gems that you might have looked over or not appreciated at the time. Like, my go-to is Pendragon, right? Pendragon, if you look at it, it's one of the first games that really aggressively uses its mechanics to enforce genre on the game. If you want to play Pendragon, you have to be an Arthurian knight. Like, the game will not allow you to be anything else. It kind of does the opposite of that. You can do whatever you want with this role-playing game thing. It's like, no, you're going to be a knight, and if you don't like that, just go find another game, because this is what this game is about. And I think that's really cool. You don't see a lot of kind of early games taking that hard stance and just being like, this is it. You don't like it? Too bad.
It's honest. That
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
honest. This is what we
And
do.
and mechanically honest, right? Like Vampire and Shadowrun both tried to be things that I don't think they quite met their intended goal, but you know, they tried. They put that stake in the ground. Whether or not Vampire succeeded at being a game of personal angst and storytelling doesn't really matter anymore, because it said this is possible. It said we want a game that focuses on inter-character drama. We're going to try and make that game, and in some ways we're going to succeed, and in some ways we're going to fail, but you can do this. You don't have to strap on your baldricks and sharpen your scimitars and get down into the dungeon. You could do a different thing. And that I think is huge. I think that's really cool.
Sweet. So Doug, our nerd editor and chief nerd editor over on the website, has a question for you. You approach a new game with the way a writer approaches a story, with the theme or concept to explore, and then find the system that best matches.
So I'm a bit unusual as a game master, because I am not just playing games with and for my group, right? Like, I don't really think about my campaigns as tabletop role-playing game campaigns anymore. I think of them as shows. And so I have to think about casting that show. I have to think about the kinds of things that we're going to do in the show. I have to think about the other shows that I'm doing and how this is going to fit into that space. So for me, usually the process is working with, like with RollPlay, I work with JP, the producer, the creator, and we talk about, you know, what do we want this show to be like? You know, if we're doing a new D&D show, we're going to be like, when we started Court of Swords, I was like, all right, how are we going to differentiate this? What's going to be different about this? We'd already settled on D&D. We knew we wanted to do a D&D show. So we picked our cast and we created the setting and the sort of style of the show to stand out in that space, because it's getting pretty crowded. You got to really like have that value add, right? But then with Nebula Jazz, which is our Fate Accelerated game, I picked the genre to match the cast. We were like, I know we want to do a show with these people, right? With Sam and Jesse and Pocket and Dodger. We were like, these are my cast. I love these people. We want to do a show with them. And I sat down with them and I said, okay, what kind of show do you guys want to do? What would be fun for you? And we settled on kind of goofy sci-fi, like Guardians of the Galaxy style. And then I picked a system that would support that. So I think every campaign is a little bit different depending on my priorities for the campaign. We'll pick different things at different times depending on what's already set and what's the impetus for starting the game. For me, as the GM, obviously the system is super important, because the system is going to help the players create the kind of fiction that I want to give the audience. So if I mismatch that, if we pick the wrong thing, then it's going to be a struggle against it. That being said, sometimes you pick a cast and sometimes you pick a game and you start playing and you realize that the game is not helping and that the show is not what you expected. Like with Mirror Shades, which was our Shadowrun show, we were doing a first edition of Shadowrun because it's the simplest version of the game. And it was a very 80s game, and I wanted to set it as just a typical Shadowrun game, right? Like tough characters who are in bad situations, fighting the corporations, doing the cyberpunk thing. And within a half dozen episodes, the characters and the players and the audience all made it clear the thing that they cared about wasn't any of that. It was like the characters' relationships to one another, and it became kind of like an 80s sitcom set in the Shadowrun world where the characters are bad Shadowrunners. And so we ended up continuing to use Shadowrun, but Shadowrun was not doing us any favors. It was just there to resolve like conflict, and it didn't help anymore. And so I had to build on mechanisms onto the game to help us focus on the things that we actually cared about. So, you know, even if you put a bunch of time into it, even if you intend for it to be a certain way, the unpredictability of role-playing games as a thing, the fact that role-playing games are inherently unpredictable, makes it so that you can do your best, but you may need to change systems partway or hack those systems to make them fit the game that you're playing. And this is true at the table. It's true on stream. I think that being flexible about that stuff means you're going to get the best experience out of it. But for me, it totally depends. I come at it from a different angle every time.
So as kind of like a follow-up to that is, how is all the streaming that's going on affecting what you guys are doing, the shows that you're producing, and how much in your consciousness is that when you're approaching a new project?
So right now I'm running two shows for RollPlay, and I'm running two shows as Roll20's GM in residence. 2 of those 4 shows are Dungeons and Dragons. One is a homebrew campaign world. It uses a bunch of rules that we've created for that campaign, and it's 50 plus episodes in now. The other D&D game we're running Tomb of Annihilation, so it's very much like by the book D&D from a pre-published adventure, so very different experiences. And then I'm playing two small press games, right? We're playing Burning Wheel and Fate Accelerated. And I think for me, the thing that once we get a show going, my job is as much creative director of the show. So I make sure the show feels like our intended plan for the show. So I keep us on track. If the show is like dark fantasy, I try to keep it fairly serious. If it's goofy sci-fi, I try to keep it away from being too serious. And I will do that by creating situations, creating NPCs, and just like actively talking to the cast members to be like, all right, so like the arc we're on right now is like a little dark. I'm thinking of lightening it up. How can we do that? And I work with the cast to keep those going. But in terms of the greater ecosystem, I think that it's important for us right now to show that we can do D&D in a different way, right? Like even the show that we're doing for D&D, the Roll20 Tomb of Annihilation show, every show that we do, there's a few people in the audience who are like, wow, this is nothing like how I play D&D. And that I love that. That's my favorite feedback, because you can play D&D so many different ways. And I think that's what's important about playing a D&D campaign. Like if we were just mimicking Critical Role, or we were just playing D&D the way people expect us to, I don't think we'd be contributing anything to the space. And then on the other hand, I always want to be playing games that people either haven't heard of, or something that will introduce people to a new angle on the hobby, because I want people to go out and learn that there are other games. I don't necessarily want everybody to be playing Fate Accelerated or playing Burning Wheel, though I love those games. I just want them to see there's other cool, fun ways to play role-playing games that aren't just D&D. Like you can play both. Thankfully, I have the time to play 4 role-playing game campaigns a week. But I think that it's super important for the right group and the right game to come together, and that isn't always D&D, or it isn't always D&D the way you expect to play it. So it's fun to be able to share that with people. And I definitely think about how are we doing this in a way no one else is, because that's not only good play, but it's good business, right? Like it's how you stand out in that space.
It's going to be a little odd too, because you guys were early to the space, right? So, so some of the stuff that you're now looking at and maybe trying to stand out and be different from is yourself, like a mirror, right? Almost.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, and this is true of Twitch as a platform and media, like period, across the board since time immemorial. The idea that the front runners will do a thing a certain way, people will replicate that and then deviate from it and create new things, and then the front runners continue to do it their own way, right? Like, I think it is really cool watching these trends kind of build up, the way things are structured, change those, and then like you say, when we make a change, we're changing not only the way we do things, but our influence on the space as well. And this can be anything from the games that we play to the way that we stream, right? Do we do 4-hour or 5-hour sessions? Do we play with 3, 4, or 5 cast members? How often we do take breaks? How are the overlays structured? And it's really cool when someone tries to do that a different way, whether I like personally like it or not. It's really neat, and I try to stay on top of that. I tune into lots of D&D streams just to see kind of what people are doing.
Do you have any D&D streams you're watching regularly? I find as a content creator, it's really tough.
I spend 16 hours plus a week. It was rounded up to 20 because we do all the Patreon stuff. I spend 20 hours a week live just doing role-playing games. I spend another probably 20 doing my own channel stuff with video games, and then I spend another 10 to 20 a week doing other stream stuff. So my like work week just sitting at my computer doing shit is 60 hours plus all of the other social media engagement and like reading role-playing games, doing prep and all of that. So people ask me this a lot. They're like, oh, have you listened to Friends of the Table? Have you watched all of Critical Role? Do you watch, all of this GM's like videos? What do you think of this book? And I'm like, yo, I do not have time for that stuff. I'm busy busting my ass for you people. And I love it, but I have to aggressively go out of my way to schedule time to do that stuff. For me, I'll pop in. So usually when I'm done work, I'll take 10 or 15 minutes and I'll see kind of what's going on. I'll check out the D&D category on Twitch. you know, if a fan suggests something to me, whether it's a game or a stream or whatever, a YouTube series, I'll give it like at least 5 minutes. I'll check it out because, you know, I've been turned on to a lot of really cool stuff by fans. And as a person who consumes media, you've only got so much time and you only got 2 eyes and 2 ears. So having people suggest things to me is always welcome. I just don't always have time to be like, yes, I've watched every episode of the 186 episodes of this show that you think is cool. I have lots of opinions about that. I just don't have time. I wish that I did, but I also think that there's a level to which you kind of, you know, writers talk about this a lot, where you sort of dip into a thing and see what it's about, but you don't want to get too into it, because I know, and I don't know if other people are like this, but I know that if I watch a lot of something or I get really into something, it definitely influences the things that I'm doing. So if I'm running a fantasy game and I'm focused on doing fantasy stuff, I try to avoid absorbing like a lot of sci-fi, because it's going to make me be like, I just want to play some sci-fi now. Like I'm getting bored of D&D. So I really do have to kind of like have some discipline around that and focus on it.
The ADD starts kicking in. I totally get that. And I also get, you know, how much time you put into what you're doing. I mean, we do a live stream 6 days a week. We put out 10 videos a week. You know, I'm this week I'll be playing in 4 games, you know, usually at least 3 games. So definitely I know where you're coming at from there. Now let's switch gears a little bit and get into like a really important question from Ahmed. Advice on getting awesome hair like yours, Adam.
Well, for most people, if you just do nothing, your hair will grow from your head or other parts of your body, and then you can have a professional cut it and then make it different colors. It's fantastic.
Although I feel like at this point in my life, I'm having more of the hair growing in places I don't want it and less of it growing where I do want it.
Listen, you just take it where you can get it. All right, just love it, live it. It's you don't get a lot of choice. Bodies are confusing and strange, and they tell you that only happens once, but it's your whole life. You're trapped in a weird meat prison, and you have no control over it. So just embrace it.
Weird meat prison.
Yeah, at least for now, until we can upload our minds into as hot cyborgs, and then get on that. If you're watching this, and you're like a teenager, when you're our age, when you're an old ass man, you're gonna be able to. I envy you and your cyber body of the future. Here's to you, teenagers of 2017.
When they're looking back at the archives and they stumble upon this.
That's right. Yeah. When you're watching this in the year 3654 from whatever planets we've colonized, and Earth is a tragic mess, remember we were thinking of you, future children.
So Hemron has a question about your GM style. Do you prefer to plan your games, or do you use a lot of improv?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of false binaries in the world and in role-playing games. There's this false binary between prep and improv. I think you have to do both all the time. I think different games will ask you to do different prep, right? Like Burning Wheel, I do almost no prep, but I think about the game and its NPCs constantly, because that's how you play that game. With a game like Stars Without Number or Apocalypse World, there are structured prep activities. With Dungeons and Dragons, you make a dungeon if you need one. You prep encounters if you need to do that. For me, I think the thing is I will do what the game tells me to do, and then I will follow that up with whatever feels appropriate for the campaign. So I do more prep for, say, Court of Swords, which is a 5e D&D game, than I do for Fate Accelerated for Nebula Jazz, because I can't prep for Nebula Jazz. Nebula Jazz is almost purely improvised. But what I do, my most useful GM prep, the most useful thing that I do is keep the improv engine warm, right? Like, even if I'm not playing a role-playing game, I'm playing other games, I'm reading books, I'm watching TV, I'm doing creative stuff. Photography is a really big part of my creative process, because just going for a walk, walking around for an hour and looking at the world as not just a thing that kind of like moves around me, but as something I can harvest imagery from, changes the way that I look at and think about the universe. So I think that this is, for me, the biggest advice about like improving yourself as a game master. It's about always doing prep, but also not relying on concrete prep. It's about thinking like a game master all the time and just like harvesting the world around you for cool ideas. I have a notebook that I carry around with me, and if I don't have that, I'll make audio notes on my phone about things that'll happen to me in the world, right? I'll see an image, I'll see a city out the window on a plane trip, and think about, oh, this would make a really cool image for like a spaceship landing on a planet, and I'll write that down, or I'll think about it in a way that stores it in memory. And so you can prime the engine for improv by doing kind of unorthodox prep. But again, the game requires that you do a certain kind or a certain amount of prep, and follow the rules of the game to let you know how much that is, and then adjust according to your group and according to your preferred play style.
Yeah, we talk about on our channel not doing a lot of prep. As GMs, we just don't do much prep. But that's not the same. Like, you kind of touched on some things, and it's not that we don't actually do prep. We spend more time thinking about the game than flipping through books and writing stuff.
I think about my role-playing games all the damn time, like constantly. Like, I am always thinking about them. I'm thinking about the NPCs. I'm thinking about like what might happen in the next session, but I'm not devoting time directly to like drawing squares on a piece of graph paper. Like, I'm thinking about the worlds that these games are taking place in constantly. And that for me is a form of prep.
And that's what I think, like, I think that's something people miss, is like, if you want to become good at not prepping a lot for your game, you need to internalize it, and spend some time with yourself, mulling over the game and what your players might do, and a couple ideas that you might want to throw out. So then, like 10 minutes before the game, I may pull up a couple stats for things that may come up, but for the most part, it's
I've gotten so practiced at high speed encounter building in D&D. So what I'll do, and you can see me do this if you watch Court of Swords, especially like earlier episodes where we were more focused on doing like combat encounters and stuff, I would realize my radar would ping that like, oh, okay, I might need some stats and stuff. And I've gotten really good at multitasking. So I've been like, all right, so here's a situation that I can kind of halfway pay attention to, and the players will role play with each other and they'll interact with that thing. And while that's happening, I've got another tab open. I'm like, grab a map, grab some NPCs, building this encounter, ready to go. And then as soon as they're like, I draw my sword, I'm like, fucking awesome. Drag them over to the screen and bam, we're ready for the encounter. And a lot of that comes from, there is a complexity to D&D that if you want to do it mechanically, right? Like, anybody can be like, all right, so there's like 4 thugs and a wizard and an acolyte, and you got to fight them and whatever. We'll just theater of the mind that thing. But if you want to use the maps and do all of that, if you're doing it at the table, it's way harder to improvise that, because you got to find your minis and you got to like lay out the map and you got to draw it and whatever. But using Roll20 has spoiled me, because all I have to do is, I'm like, all right, you're in a forest. I just search for a forest map, grab it, throw it in there, size it, and then I have the monster manual at hand. So I can just be like, thug, 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 tokens copied, ready, go. And I can do it quickly. And that's just it's practice, right? It's like getting ready to do that as fast as possible. If I can prep in advance, if I know that a big encounter is coming up, I'll obviously ready that. But the tools that you use, especially for a game like D&D, are hugely important. At least I've found that to be the case.
Know your resources and know how to use them, and know your capabilities.
Yeah, totally.
And it's actually one of the things we tell people all the time when they're like, "Oh, how much prep?" I'm like, "How much do you need?" That's what you prep. And it's different for everybody. Like you're saying, you build counters on the fly really fast because you become really practiced at it. And if someone else who isn't, doesn't matter. Just do what you need to do. So Fergal has a question. Do you feel pressured to provide more entertainment when you're streaming, or does it all come naturally?
I don't know that it's about it coming naturally, because nothing in role-playing games comes naturally. Role-playing games are there to make you do things that do not come naturally. Like storytelling and playing make-believe and pretending is something that we do as children, right? Like that's just a thing that happens. Human experience is about storytelling. So that part, I think, is always the case. And some people are going to feel more comfortable being storytellers than others. But I think that when you're doing a show on Twitch, when you're creating content for an audience, you're always aware of that audience. You're always thinking about what they are watching, thinking about what would be entertaining for them. And I think this is a natural outflow, not only from storytelling as a discipline, but also a natural outflow from playing with a group. Because when you're playing a role-playing game, you're not just there to make up a story for nobody. You're there to make up a story for your friends. You're like building this encounter with the orcs and the priest of Grumsh because you think it'll be fun for your players to experience, and they're enjoying that. So in a way, they're your audience, and all I'm doing is extending that out to the thousands of people that watch the show every week and making them part of my group in that way. So I want to give them cool things to see, and I describe things in a way that I think is going to be easy to interpret and understand. And I absolutely think that chat as an organism, my audience, is a part of the game experience. And so yeah, it definitely affects how I play.
So there's a couple things I wanted to at least mention, just in case people weren't aware. You did a GM roundtable recently with the Mats and Mike Merles, which was really great. And that was actually one of the things I did block out some time to check out. I thought it was a great roundtable. I felt that Mike and Matt Mercer were very centralist in their views, and then on either end you had Matt Colville and yourself. And you guys were able to talk and disagree and have great discussions, in a nice civilized environment. And it was those differences that really made it pop for me too.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that being able to engage with someone like Matt. I love Matt Colville because we have a lot in common. We like a lot of the same stuff and come at a lot of things very similarly, but we also have some very different opinions about things because of our history and our preferences as role players. And I love being able to engage with someone who doesn't necessarily agree with, we don't agree with each other, but are able to talk about those things in a way that is entertaining for the audience. That's super fun. I love doing that roundtable. I think Mike, the great thing about Mike Merles is that he works at Wizards of the Coast, right? His financial well-being is tied to Dungeons and Dragons, but he has all these really interesting ideas about how it could be different or better. And he recognizes that he's part of a team and that the company as a group made some choices about D&D, but he's also able to say, like, if I were the boss of D&D, if this was just my game, if I was making a little indie RPG, this is what it would be like. And I love having that conversation with him about that, for sure.
Well, it was definitely, guys, if you haven't checked it out, you should check it out. It's over on YouTube on Adam's channel. You can go find it over there easily. Also, I was lucky enough to be in the front row for the improv show you did at PAX Unplugged. You guys all did such an amazing job up there.
Yeah, I was really excited to get to do that. So the panel was a bunch of DMs and players from the kind of like Twitch and YouTube Dungeons and Dragons space, role-playing game space. And we were doing an improv challenge where we would take turns having 7 minutes to GM the rest of the group, and they would all get characters, and you basically do like a couple of scenes. And as the GM, you have a hidden goal that you're trying to move towards. And it was a really fun improv experience. And originally I was going to do it at Gen Con, but I was in Japan right before I went to Gen Con, and I wasn't available for the first day. So it was really cool to be able to follow up and do that at Unplugged. Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, Gen Con was actually where I first got to meet you in person. You're walking by, and I'm like, is that Cole? I think so. There's a lot of pink hair around here. I'm not positive. So I used my patented move of just yelling the first name. Oh, turn around, must be.
Yep. Yeah, I love Gen Con. I've been going for I think 10 years now, 10 or 11 years, and it's it's always fun. It's a little overwhelming. It's a big con, especially if you, like me, work at a booth all day and then stay up late playing role-playing games all night. But it's always a highlight. I really like going. Even though I'm not a big fan of going all the way to Indianapolis, I do like Gen Con. It's worth it. It's worth the trip for me.
It was actually my first Gen Con and like my third gaming convention.
Oh, cool.
So this year I've been kind of like shotgunning a bunch as Nerdarchy and trying to get deeper involved with that. And it is a lot of fun to actually get to meet people in person that maybe you've only met over the internet.
Yeah, that's my reason for going. Like, for me, cons have so much overlap, right? Like I go to PAX East. I'm there both as a Twitch broadcaster and I do signings at the Twitch booth. I'm going as a game developer, so I'm there to sign copies of Dungeon World and talk to people about design. I'm there at the Burning Wheel booth, selling games, doing the retail thing, and I'm there to meet fans for all of that stuff. And they're exhausting, but they're really fun. And I like them because, like you said, they're often the only opportunity that I have to see people who are as busy as I am. It's that whole content creator thing where you're just like, I gotta go, and I'm only gonna have 2 days to see these people that live halfway across the world from me. And you go and you do your thing, you get to play some games, and you don't sleep very much, and then you go home and you go back to work. But yeah, if you haven't been to, if people in the audience, if you haven't been to a con, even if you're just going to like a local, like a little guy, game cons are a super great way to like play new games, meet new people. Dungeon World wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a little convention in Seattle called Go Play. So yeah, they're definitely a great place to engage with the community.
How long did it take you to embrace with the fact that you do have fans? Because for it's been like, we're pretty new to it, I guess, in comparison. We started in 2014, takes a little time to build up, and like, my one partner and my brother-in-law and friend Ted, was embraced it really fast, and he's like fans, and the rest of them look at me like, you don't use the F word. We never use the F word. It's just weird.
Yeah, it's I mean, I've, to some degree or another, I've had a relationship with people that is at that sort of remove, and it started for me with Dungeon World, right, where people would come up to me at a con, or they'd see me at a booth and be like, hey, I played your game, I'm so and so on the internet, maybe we've talked about Dungeon World, it's really fun, thanks for making it, will you sign my book? And for me, that's always been really, it's been really cool. And I don't think I've ever felt uncomfortable with having fans. Obviously, like now the scale of it is so much bigger, right? Like I have a lot more people who know who I am, who recognize me because my face and my voice are out there in a way that they never were before when I just made the game. But I love it. It gives me something to have. People ask me this a lot, actually. They're like, how do you feel about fans coming up to you at cons? And be like, I love your show. Like, I watch everything that you do. Does that make you feel weird? And I'm like, no. So the thing about it for me is we already have something in common, because when someone comes up to me and they're like, oh, yo, I love Kurosawa, I'm like, well, me too. Like, I also love that. I'm making it, but it's really fun to do that. Have you seen the episode where this happened? Or like, what's your favorite character? Oh man, I love that guy. Like, we have something in common already. And that to me eases that social experience. It's nice. I really like it. Every time somebody tweets at me and is like, I saw you at PAX, so I was too nervous to say hi. I'm like, Pat, you just, next time you come over and you say hi. I love it. I'm super excited. And that's something that I've eased into really, really nicely, and it feels really good for me when people, are fans.
It's kind of funny because I'm both those guys, right?
Yeah.
I'm that guy that goes, hey, no, you should have came over and said hi. Absolutely. And I'm also at the same time, I'm that person. I don't want to bother you. I know you're getting bothered all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking of it as bothering a person is maybe a way to misidentify it, because like for me, the reason why, like, I like cons where I get to hang out at a booth, right? I like PAX East, Gen Con, Unplugged. I spent a lot of time at the booth with the Burning Wheel folks, because it gives me somewhere central for people to come and find me. And I just get to spend like 4 hours straight having people tell me they love the stuff that I do. And I'm like, yes, do it. Just come over here. Tell me how much you love Dungeon World. It makes me feel good. I love it. And we'll talk and we'll hang out. And I'll engage with fans. But when I'm out on the floor, it's the same thing, right? Like, I know I'm around people who might have seen the stuff that I like. And I'm never, like, if I'm in a hurry, if I'm going somewhere and someone comes up to me and they're like, hey, I really like Dungeon World, I'm like, cool. I cannot stop to ask you why you like it so much. I'm really happy. I'm going to do a panel. Come find me at the booth later. Like, thank you. And I'll tell you, I'm not the kind of person who's going to stand around and be like, I really got to go, but it's really awkward. This person isn't letting me leave. I'll be like, yo, thank you so much, but I got to run. I'll see you on the internet. So I think if people are shy, and I think we're in a hobby where there are a lot of people who feel shy, who feel uncomfortable with the idea of approaching a stranger, especially a stranger that they are familiar with, and they feel like they're imposing or they're a burden. I think as long as you're polite, and as long as you're willing to hear the, like, oh, they're busy now, I got my hello, they're gonna go, do it. Go say hi, because I don't know a single content creator who doesn't love that reinforcement, who isn't into it, because God knows we get enough negative reinforcement, right? Like, I need one person for every shitty tweet that I get about how garbage I am to like even it out. So be that person. Save me from how bad YouTube comments are sometimes, please.
No, absolutely. And when I use the word bother, that's me internalizing anyway.
Yeah, totally.
And it's because it's funny when from doing this stuff, when people go, oh, well, you know, I'm not an extrovert like you, right? I've heard that. And I'm like, I'm not. I'm an introvert. I've always been an introvert. I've just always made myself do things that make me uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, that's a lot of it too. I know a lot of broadcasters who don't consider themselves like big, like social people. I hate like unstructured socializing. Parties make me anxious. But that's what's great about role-playing games is that they give you structure to socialize in. Like I have really great friendships with a lot of people because of playing role-playing games with them, because when you're in that awkward, I don't know you very well phase, you can use the role-playing game to be like, oh, okay, cool. So it's your turn to talk. And then they do their thing and they take their turn and they describe their character and they do their thing. And you're like, oh, that's really cool. And then you take your turn and you get into a flow with them that the rules of the game and that the structure of playing a role-playing game encourages. And it's hugely important to me in terms of like building friendships with people. If I want to be friends with someone, I will invite them to play a role-playing game with me so we can get to know each other better. I think it's a great way to do that.
Do you have your con schedule for next year yet?
Take the amount of cons that I can handle going to without losing my mind, and then add 3 cons to it, and that's probably what I'm doing next year. Every year I definitely go to Go Play Northwest, which is the little indie con in Seattle. I go to that one every year. I go to Gen Con every year. I will almost certainly go to PAX East because East is fit into the space such that there's enough time between cons. And then I'll probably go to Unplugged. And then if I get in, sometimes like every year I get invited to stuff. And if somebody says to me like, yo, we want to fly you to this con and pay you to do a panel or pay you to be a guest of honor, I almost always say yes, because I will find time for those things.
Money's good.
Yeah, right. Like, and I love doing that stuff. But those are the unpredictable cons where I'm like, well, yep, I guess. The other thing is that it's hard because I do with roleplay, we do 4 or 5 live shows a year, and that's me flying to Texas 4 or 5 times a year, and that's 5 days. Even if it's just a 1-day show, that's like a 4 or 5 day process. So yeah, I do a lot of traveling, and I anticipate probably doing more. But I always make a point of trying to warn people in advance, be like, yo, I'm gonna be at this con. This is where I'll be. I always publish my schedule so people don't miss panels and stuff. But yeah, Gen Con for sure, PAX East almost certainly, and then Go Play every year.
Yeah, I was trying to figure it out. I had a list of ones I wanted to go to, and then I realized one of the ones I wanted to go to, I cannot, because we're actually getting paid to do our first gigs, essentially.
Yeah,
at a concoction in Cleveland. So that's really cool. It's a kind of a new step for us. But I promised only to keep you an hour, right around that hour mark. So if you just want to like some parting words.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, if folks want to check out any of the stuff that I do, you can find me on Twitter. I'm Skinny Ghost on Twitter. My main content hub is twitch.tv/Adam Koebel. Usually I'll host if I'm on another show, if I'm doing Roll20 stuff or D&D stuff, you'll find it there. You can find our game. You can find Dungeon World at dungeon.world. You can check it out there.
Yeah, the link to Adam's website and all the socials is in the description as always, guys. Adam, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate you doing that. And thanks everyone for hanging out with us today. So with that, until next time, guys, stay nerdy.